Okay, so in part two of this week's lecture on digital sociology, I'll be looking at the notion of everyday life and algorithms and the way understandings of labour are changing in this new era. So algorithms in particular are becoming an increasingly key influence on our lives, and we need to get an understanding, I suppose, of how these ways that the kind of our data lives are kind of become collapsed into these platforms. They're measured and kind of stored and then used to sell stuff back to us. And this kind of distortive process that goes on in that our sociologists are increasingly finding problematic in terms of relations of gender, class, and race. So the way these things have been incorporated into our everyday lives has just happened throughout time. They're just so normal now that we kind of, the mobile phone is almost a part of our body. But as critical sociologists are particularly concerned with, these new algorithmic technologies, these new mobile devices, permit much kind of higher levels of surveillance than we've ever really experienced before. And again, we can think back to previous weeks here around Foucault and the panopticon and the technology of the self. So we experience and use these things in a day-to-day way for our own needs and for our own wants and for our leisure practices, the way that we relate to each other, the way that we, keep up with family and people overseas. And it's particularly the case when it comes to our leisure practices and the way that we seek information and entertainment. And they also tether us to work, we're constantly checking email, or tethers you to being a student. So again, there's risks and affordances going on here. But every kind of keystroke, every click, we're generating data for these companies to monitor us with and to sell to other companies to sell us stuff with. This stuff is harvested, mined, stored, and we're increasingly being profiled by these things, largely without our own knowledge and largely in ways that we don't really understand how they're being used. One of the ways to think about how we engage with internet platforms, whether it's social media or various services and websites in general, is developed through the idea of prosumption. So many of the platforms we now engage, it's actually the users that are creating the content and sharing it. It's the users that in this sense are doing the work. So this is the idea of prosumption in this sense, that people coming to use a particular thing that would have been, traditionally seen as a form of consumption. Now people are on those things producing the material that the company uses to keep the whole thing going. So this means that the ways we've started to kind of communicate with other people, the way that we access news, pop culture and all this kind of stuff, the way that we kind of have an increasingly blurred sense between work and leisure, these platforms have fundamentally changed this stuff. We can be at work, for instance, but be on Facebook. So, you'd be at your job, but you're also then kind of doing work for a social media company as well. So prosumption in this sense is used to indicate the kind of blurry nature of production and consumption today, and how digital media is particularly developed and, I suppose, not enforced, but like kind of encouraged this kind of behaviour, this kind of practice, I suppose, from a sociological point of view. So, in many ways, what these companies do is they co-opt our day-to-day lives, our leisure activities, our loves, our passions, our emotions. So if, a surfer goes out and, catches a good wave, captures it on a GoPro, you upload it to YouTube so other people can see it. You're doing it all for free and you're doing it for your own needs and wants, but really then you are providing content for these companies for free. You are working for them for free. And this is pretty much the norm now of most many of the more important digital platforms. Google Maps exists basically by tracking our own data, and its accuracy largely depends on, increased amounts of people using it. Amazon, was once just a kind of bookseller. Now it's kind of, relies in many ways on people's consumption habits, writing reviews about whether, shops are deemed as good or bad, and whether books are seen as good and bad. And there's a whole interesting study about the way those things are distorted or manipulated to certain ends. As I said, uploading on YouTube. I mean, in many ways, me uploading these lectures to YouTube for students to be able to kind of freely view them is a good example of the more blurry demarcation between, you know, what I get paid for in my job and some of the other kind of free labor that I do. Every time you click, like, share stuff on any social media platform, again, you're doing work here for these companies because you are providing them with data. So the sociological term for this is immaterial labor. Essentially, here's the idea that if you have a social media account, you work for it for free, whether you like it or not. If you're on there, you're working for them. So immaterial labor here refers to new forms of skills, and, you know, people are training for this kind of stuff. So there are many aspects of immaterial labor that people are paid for. It's their career. You know, anyone working in the, you know, digital, internet, cybernetics, computer kind of areas are kind of doing immaterial labor. But on the other hand, it also refers to this kind of free cultural labor that I've been talking about in this section. Anytime you're on social media, you're doing this kind of labor, and you're not getting paid for it. So that's one aspect of what's sociologically interesting about that. As many people seem to have started working for companies in this sense, even though, you know, you're not getting paid by them. What, from a sociological perspective, is also really interesting here is the way that these therefore often reinforces, you know, cultural, gendered norms in particular. So, for instance, you know, the algorithm on TikTok has been shown and seems to be deliberately created to push more normatively attractive people to the front of the list, as opposed to, you know, apparently normative ugly people. So the algorithm in this sense is not free of value, even though we kind of go onto these platforms and, you know, behave and practice the way that we do things in this kind of, you know, just getting on with day-to-day life. The data that then's reflected back to us in the way these things work isn't necessarily reflective of, you know, society itself. It becomes, they become biased in their own way. And again, I'll talk about a little bit about that later in the lecture in more detail. Again, importantly, what this also then does is free labor. It kind of then sets the standards for different things like, you know, artistic standards, fashions, tastes, consumer norms, you know, trends, what's cool, what's edgy, and all this kind of stuff. Increasingly, too, these relationship between our online activities and the way that algorithms kind of measure, track, store, and then, you know, reflect this back to us has real effects on public opinion and the way the kind of political debates play out. Another way of important thing to consider about the kind of relatively new digital realm is what's been called the digital divide. So it is, I suppose, increasingly, you know, people think that everyone kind of has access to this now, and you know, more people do than ever before, but there's still kind of huge divides throughout the world. You know, if we're thinking about back to globalization, about who has access to this. One of the quotes that always stayed with me out of Castells' work, and this would be dated now, and I'm sure it's not the same, but like, he wrote that even though I'm writing here about what this new information age, at the time in the 90s, less than half the world's population had ever made a phone call. I'm sure that's different now with the rise of mobile phones, but I think it's a kind of good encapsulation of how the digital divide is still a real thing, particularly in terms of the production of them, of the stuff we use, like mobile phones, in, you know, very poor working conditions, people not getting paid very well to make them, and, you know, suffering the effects of being exposed to all kinds of chemicals, to the kind of Western world where we're largely consumers of these things. There's also other examples of this in terms of, you know, children, different countries, you know, censorship, you know, people in prison and stuff like that have no access to these things. It's interesting in many respects that people are increasingly seeing, you know, access to the internet as a human right, but it's certainly, you know, not universal in that sense. Importantly too, even those that have access to devices and the internet or whatever, there's also communication barriers that very much map on to, you know, fairly traditional inequalities, again, that we'll look at later in the course. So in this sense, access is not the only issue when it comes to the digital divide. Social disadvantage in the digital age is not just about access. We need to look at ways that different groups use these technologies, and the ways that different groups can kind of dominate these technologies more than others. So in this sense, rather than the digital divide, the idea of digital social inequality has become a kind of more, recent way of thinking about these inequalities. What much sociology shows is that gender, age, race, ethnicity, class, all these things fundamentally influence the way digital technology are used, the way that people relate to each other, and the way that different people are treated, and whether they're valued or not in particular. So, relating back to the idea that the web produces kind of a kind of democratic idea as well, that everyone can kind of have access to it and you can kind of be yourself. Increasingly, where the web used to be somewhat of a kind of zone of freedom of expression, all this kind of stuff, and again that's pretty antiquated now. It probably was only like that up until maybe the late 90s at best, and even then multinational corporations were increasingly controlling it. More today, it's just the internet is controlled by an ever fewer amount of multinational corporations. Most news sites, social media sites require registration or even a fee. But harking back to the week on culture and media, the ownership of these things is very, very slim, just like the ownerships of television stations and newspapers. Also, the divide between public and private is blurred through these things. We constantly got to put in our personal details into stuff that we're often unsure about. Tick boxes with 26 pages of legalese where you're kind of giving up your rights and that kind of stuff, and we often don't really understand what we're doing there. How could you? Who has time to read those things? There's an ethical thing going on here in terms of our free immaterial labour, about how this is then used commercially, yet we don't really get any reward for it. So in many sense, we're creators on the web in terms of allowing our day-to-day life to be tracked, but that surplus value, in a sense, is siphoned off, and only the ruling class benefit from it, from that kind of Marxist point of view. And of course, the web also supports the worst of kind of human exploitation and what humans get up to, things like child porn, youth suicide, the dark web, buying guns and drugs and stuff like that. So again, the web, as much as offering emancipatory progress and stuff like that, has all these negative things as well. Essentially, the web in many respects is just reflecting, IRL in real life, and is now completely embedded in it as well. So again, sociologists are kind of interested in what all this means in terms of our day-to-day lives, in terms of how institutions work, how our politics works, and how inequalities happen. I'll leave that there, and I'll come back in part 3 to talk about memes and GIFs.